Welcome back to Task and Purpose. I'm your average infantryman, Chris Cappy. Considering everything we've recently learned about modern large-scale warfare, does it still make sense for the US Army to adopt this new primary rifle, the XM5 SPEAR? Or is it overkill? Would your regular Ukrainian infantryman rather carry the standard lightweight, low-recoil Soviet AK-74 or the new, more powerful American XM5 into battle? To switch to the new weapon, it would cost the US Army an estimated $4.7 billion. Would that money be better invested into additional Javelin shoulder-fired anti-tank weapons and attack drones for every squad? In order to find out, I interviewed several combat veterans from the Ukraine war for their opinions. Let's examine if the American XM5 would actually be effective or a burden in the kind of large-scale near-peer war that it was specifically designed for. But first, we talk a lot on this channel about how important ergonomics are in our military equipment, and that's why I use Raycon everyday earbuds. Their interface is incredibly intuitive. You just tap on the right earbud for volume up, tap on the left for volume down. Tap 2 times for play and pause, and 3 times have the next song play. There's even a voice assistant feature. Hey phone, call John Kirby at the Pentagon and let him know I'm gonna be late for dinner tonight. When you're in the military, clear communication devices that don't die after 2 hours are essential. Raycons have 8 hours of playtime and 32 hours of battery life. So if I was in the middle of an all-day training event, I know my Raycons will last. I'll be honest, I've got weirdly shaped ear holes, okay? It's not just the hairy arms that I have. Raycon earbuds come with a number of optimized gel tips, so they fit perfectly in all ear shapes for a snug, no budge fit. You get top quality audio at half the price of other premium brands. They have 50,000 5-star reviews as proof of their quality. If you're interested, click the link in this video's description and get 15% off your Raycon earbud order. So 2 months after the invasion of Ukraine, in April 2022, the American military announced they would officially switch primary rifles for their regular infantry. But the decision wasn't final. The US Army still needs to test a small number of weapons first before deciding whether to go ahead with replacing 400,000 rifles in total eventually. But you can bet the US Department of Defense is definitely closely monitoring how small arms combat unfolds in Ukraine to analyze whether or not the XM5 is still the right weapon to switch to. This is because the Russian invasion of Ukraine is exactly the kind of warfare this weapon was originally designed to combat. So what conclusions might they be drawing right now? Well, there are some trade-offs with the XM5 rifle. Mainly, you're carrying an additional 5 extra pounds or 2.2 kilograms of weight, and with the bigger round, you have room for 70 less rounds of ammunition in total for a standard loadout. But in exchange for that, you get twice the max range and power against enemy body armor. But did this turn out to be truly necessary in Ukraine? Intercepted Russian communications from the front lines released by the Secret Service of Ukraine revealed that many regular Russian soldiers were complaining of not having any body armor or being issued body armor that was completely ineffective.
Ребята подходят, у кого за место бронепластины обычный этот экран кевларовый. Там, товарищ генерал, вот у меня такая-то ситуация, он говорит, у меня, блядь, бронежилета нет, сынок, крепись.
Reports have captured Russian plates from the front lines revealed that the fabric was torn, the plates are completely rusted, and they don't work at all. Furthermore, there is video evidence of Russian plates that can't even stop a 9mm pistol round, let alone a full-powered cartridge.
Ну дивись. Ну те да. А давай тепер 2 разом.
There's video evidence of helmets so weak they can be caved in with only a punch, let alone a bullet. Some Russian paratroopers deployed without any protection from rifle rounds. I spoke to an American veteran of the war in Ukraine who had this to say about his experience seeing Russian gear on the front lines in Kharkiv.
So the Russians are wearing flak vests, very similar to what the US soldiers were wearing in the Vietnam and Iraq wars. Plates, you could see on some of them sometimes, but it wasn't typical to see a Russian wearing like steel plates.
But defeating body armor isn't the only change here. It'll also allow troops to engage the enemy from further away. We have to look at the XM5 as a whole system, with the 6.8x51mm ammo working with the rifle and the scope to give soldiers the capability to engage targets 800 meters away, which is twice as far as your typical M4 and AK-74 can hit. Vortex fire control system that it comes with is a 1 to 8x magnification. It makes targets that are 800 meters away appear to be only 100 meters away when viewed through the scope. It's a ballistic computer that automatically calculates firing solutions with a press of the button. In theory, it would allow soldiers to hit far away targets with relatively less training required thanks to the computer-assisted scope. But is the extra range actually necessary in Ukraine? To try to understand the answer to this question, I spoke to several combat veterans in Ukraine, and I was surprised by the wide range of opinions here. Yaroslav is a junior sergeant who was deployed to defend Kharkiv region before the counteroffensive, and he said in an email to me, "All I could do was play hide and seek with artillery shells and missiles, and this is not a rare case. My fellow comrade from another brigade told me that you can forget to take your rifle into combat, but if you forget your entrenching tool, you're dead." So for a regular infantryman who in most cases is a conscript carrying an expensive toy which is much more complex and heavier than an AK would definitely be overkill. Personally, I'd love to have the XM5 rifle when I was in a combat zone, as all we had were AKs and a bunch of RPGs. But if we're talking about more elite and professional units such as air assault units, SOF, recon, XM5 rifles would fit them perfectly and would give them a huge advantage on the battlefield. I think Yaroslav brings up some really interesting points here that we'll see is supported by video evidence and by other Ukrainian veterans' testimony later in the video. There appears to be several different major forms of combat in Ukraine. The first one is where artillery slug it out, and meanwhile the infantry dig in a few kilometers in front of artillery to protect them from being overrun. In this scenario, the infantry are dug into trenches and are mainly just a deterrent to protect artillery positions. Their front lines between them and the enemy are about 10 kilometers apart, so they're out of small arms range. That is until they switch to an offensive role to try to push back the enemy artillery. According to the American veteran that I spoke to, he had this to say about long-range engagements in Ukraine.
Most of our engagements were really close range. It took place in between 50 to about 300 meters. There were longer range engagements. That was usually when we got ambushed. Most typical units did have to deal with long range engagements. But when you knew that there was some Russian forces maybe with some long-range rifles, usually conventional units would be pulled out and SOF would go in and deal with it.
So we see from video evidence that Ukrainian special forces are often the ones that close with and destroy the enemy. The XM5 rifle could give them an advantage in some of these cases where they would have further standoff from the enemy. I spoke to a veteran named Artem who's serving in the Donetsk region right now. He said from his experience, quote, "There was not a lot of times where I could see enemy far away. Right now the majority of gunfights take place in tree lines and trenches, so not a lot of range is required. Also, every time there is a fight, there is artillery firing, so a lot of dirt is flying around, and my AK-74 jammed 3 times already because of dirt, but it's quick to clean. If the XM5 is demanding to stay clean for it to work, then it's a bad idea for the infantry, and if it's heavy and long, then the weight will quickly become a problem when you have to run 300 meters. Maybe it could be useful for some SOF units, but still heavy and long weapon is not ideal for a long walk. I'm pretty comfortable with my AK, plus we don't actually shoot that often. Artillery does the majority of the work." So Artem's feedback here aligns very closely with what Yaroslav had to say. It sounds like once infantry move out to attack, they end up in close range where the XM5 might be overkill.
As far as the XM5 goes with the 1.8 optic, I mean, sure, it could benefit Ukraine if everybody had it. I wouldn't say it's necessary. It would be overkill in a way, in a good way. You know, it's always good to have one up over the enemy.
But is this anecdotal evidence of close range engagements in Ukraine simply because both sides often do not have any magnified optics, so they're forced to get in close because they have no other way to see the enemy? Or is it simply an inevitable function of fighting in towns and cities that shortens the range of engagements? It's possible Artem was limited to spotting the enemy due to not having an optic on his AK. At this point, I need to mention there are 3 important caveats to my average tier analysis here. First off, I know comparing American operational needs around the world to Ukraine's specific needs is not a perfect comparison, but I do believe there are important lessons to learn from a war that looks exactly like the kind of war that the US Army stated the XM5 was created to fight. Second caveat, this weapon is also meant to give an advantage against China's People's Liberation Army, who for all we know currently or will soon have outstanding body armor that requires the XM5 to fight against. The third exception here is that the XM5, we have to remember it's meant to work as part of a doctrine that fits in with the XM250 belt-fed machine gun, making logistics easier, as essentially your whole squad would use one type of ammunition. Shortage of ammunition is something that is brought up time and time again by the Ukrainians that I spoke to. The Vortex XM154 scope and the added max range of the XM5 cartridge reminds me in some ways of the Javelin and HIMARS. Before the battle in Ukraine, there were a lot of people who were skeptical that a relatively low number of high-tech Western solutions like the Javelin would have much of an impact on the fight at all. They believed the Russian doctrine of volume of fire, or more is more, would win out. They thought that low-tech solutions would work better. But it appears to be the case that high-tech, long-range precision fire has an advantage in modern large-scale battles. Would you rather have one Javelin or 50 RPGs? This is, of course, all hypothetical, right? I don't claim to have the answers here. I just think these are important questions to investigate. A lot of criticisms that I've seen against the XM5 are similar to criticisms about the Javelin missile before the Ukraine war, where people said it's too complicated to train on, too difficult to hit a target with, and too heavy. The Vortex NGSW fire control system with its computer-assisted shooting will give it abilities similar to what vehicle optics give gunners.
Having the ability, though, to hit 800 meters away, I think it would give them an advantage for sure. You know, having that 800-meter range, you could set up way better ambushes than something at 300 meters. And to set up an ambush that close in open farmland against, Dishkas and PKMs, it was nuts. I wouldn't have want to fight against the Russians with an M4. I would much rather go against them with the XM, for sure, the XM5.
To the point about the weapon needing to stay clean and handle dirty conditions after months on the front lines, the XM5 would likely have an advantage when it comes to reliability, dealing with dirt, and not jamming. Unlike the M4 and AK-74, soldiers can switch the XM5 to adverse gas mode if dirt were flying into the chamber. This mode sends more gas into the chamber and makes it easier to cycle rounds in dirty conditions. Its short-stroke gas piston firing system would handle dirt far better than the direct impingement of the M4. The added accuracy of the XM5 could be useful for hitting targets hiding in trenches, but inevitably the evidence shows that warfare in Ukraine that we've seen so far is brought to close quarters combat. It's the only way to capture key cities and towns that have infrastructure like railroad stations, power plants, and access to main supply roads. This means combat is inevitably brought into short range of 300 meters or less. Ben, another combat veteran from Ukraine's front lines, emailed me his thoughts on the XM5. I serve in a forward operating reconnaissance unit. My unit is in the vicinity of Bakhmut. The weight doesn't really matter. I would usually carry a 20 to 25 kilogram backpack. What's another 2 to 3 kilograms difference in a gun going to make? Range is not a huge consideration, as sniper fire would always be superior to any assault rifle armed unit, but obviously great to have at least someone near you who can shoot 1 kilometers plus and put some heavy suppressing fire on them. The range at which most of the ammo is dumped is above 500 meters. If you're talking about where ammo hits the most, it's around 100 to 200 meters. You never see your enemy closer than 100 meters, obviously with some exceptions. In those conditions, you can't expect anyone to easily hit a target over 300 meters away with an AK. If ammo wasn't a consideration, I would definitely go for something like the XM5 with much higher accuracy, longer effective range, and those 500 plus meter engagements would play out completely differently. So Ben's comments here from the front lines in Bakhmut support that a longer range rifle with an effective optic would be useful. Weight is a major factor brought up in most criticisms of the platform. The XM5 weighs 9.8 pounds or 4.4 kilograms with a suppressor. Add the fire control system, it's probably another 2.5 pounds for a total of about 11.8 pounds. Troops would likely have a basic combat loadout of 140 rounds split between 7 20-round magazines instead of the normal 210 loadout, so about 70 less rounds of ammunition. So the question here is, would the added capability be worth the added weight and lower volume of ammo in Ukraine or in any near-peer war for that matter? The AK-74M with a red dot and fully loaded weighs approximately 9 pounds in total. We've seen how important logistics and resupply is for both sides. Many Ukrainian veterans who emailed me brought up difficulty in finding ammunition and preferring a very pragmatic approach of whatever weapon had rounds left to fire. The US Army's next generation squad weapon appears to consolidate 2 ammo types into one. Instead of using 5.56 and 7.62 separately, they will only need one 6.8mm round to use for the entire squad, which would simplify logistics and make ammunition easier to maintain. We've also seen how important readiness is for equipment. The US Army on August 16th just confirmed their plans to add sensor tracking to the next generation squad weapon rifles so that all rounds fired will be counted and tracked in a database. Armament research company, ARC, creators of this technology said it will allow supply sergeants to know exactly when weapons need maintenance, barrel changes, etc. to prevent weapons from going down in the middle of combat, thus saving lives. A major lesson learned from the war in Ukraine is how valuable low-cost drones are. The US Army is integrating surveillance drones into every squad, could have information about the enemy's location potentially sent from the drone straight into their optic. When you increase the max range of a weapon, you also need to increase your capability to detect the enemy at that range, and then coordinate strikes on them. Similar to how the HIMARS rocket artillery has a UAV that sends enemy coordinates to the fire control system, the plan is to do something similar for the infantry here as well. This is something you could never do with the M4 or the AK-74 on the battlefield because their max range isn't far enough to need that. There are some US Army veterans of Iraq and Afghanistan that I've spoken to who believe the XM5 is a weapon without a war. Their argument is that the studies have shown combat engagements are typically within 300 meters. They state that the invasion of Ukraine showed that battles in cities and for key infrastructure prove this. And there's a short barrel version of the XM5, like its 8-inch version, that could be easily switched to in a matter of minutes with a barrel change in the field. The fact that Russia and China's soldiers may not have body armor right now doesn't mean that they won't have great body armor 10 years from now. Critics, on the other hand, suggest the weapon was invented for a niche concern in the war in Afghanistan, where soldiers were outranged by some Soviet weapons. So the question becomes, does the extra weight of carrying this rifle and its ammo more worthwhile than adding an extra javelin or NLAW to the squad loadout? Cash is an American that fought on the front line in Kharkiv. He emailed me his thoughts on how the XM5 would fare in Ukraine. I'm sure the XM5 is a great weapon, but losing magazine capacity while also gaining additional weight is a no-go in my opinion. The difference between 30 rounds and 20 is huge. It's all about how long an engagement can be maintained before needing to break contact because you're running low on ammo. The minutes that additional capacity buys are priceless. People often forget the main role of light infantry is to fix the enemy in place. It seems to me that the biggest thing the XM5 has going for it is modularity. Easily mounting optics that will hold its zero is a big problem for the AK platform. Did I mention that we often use RPK-74 mags with a 45 round capacity, since they're completely interchangeable with the AK-74? So Cash brings up some great points here. We're really talking about 45 rounds versus 20 rounds in many cases. Suppressing fire is an important part of the current warfighting doctrine in the US Army. Are there plans to change the US Army's doctrine to work with a more precision fire strategy? If this is the case, it would require all new training, new ranges, new battle drills. Is the Army planning to adjust their fighting style, or will the XM250 belt-fed machine gun make up for the possibly lower volume of fire? And to be fair, there are 25 round magazines for the XM5, but it's still an issue worth talking about. There are clearly a wide range of varying opinions on how effective the XM5 would be in Ukraine, or any near-peer battle for that matter. At the end of the day, I admit I don't have the answers here, but these are thought exercises worth exploring, I think. My intention was to present both sides of the argument the best I could here. Does the XM5 offer greater capability? Would the average range of engagement move further away past 800 meters if soldiers had the kind of 8x optic necessary to support it, or would they be wildly inaccurate at that range? These are important questions that we don't exactly know the answers to yet. Hopefully you found this video interesting and valuable in some way, and I earned your like and subscription. I'm your average infantryman, Chris Cappy. Thank you for watching Task and Purpose.